Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Chartered Accountants Ulster Society webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jason McIntosh, and I'm the convener of the Chartered Accountants and Business Subcommittee of the Ulster Society. As most of you will hopefully already know, the subcommittee aims to ensure that the Society remains relevant for and supportive to Chartered Accountants working in business. We aim to do this through a calendar of relevant events and content for our members, both informative and networking in nature. Many of our events, much like today's webinar, will also be relevant for wider Society members, and all Society members are welcome to attend any of our events. Recently, we held the latest in our company visit series to Rugby and Carrickfergus, and in my closing remarks today, I'll let you know a little more about what is coming up. I would encourage you to keep an eye on emails and newsletter content from the Institute to make sure you keep up to date with our events as and when they happen. After today's event, you will receive a feedback request, and I would very much welcome the opportunity to hear feedback, both on today's event and also on our calendar of events more generally, either by filling out that feedback request or by getting in touch with me directly. Without further ado, let's move on to the content of today's webinar. The title of today's webinar is Safeguarding Your Business, Fraud Awareness. Fraud is the crime that all of us are most likely to fall victim to, and I have no doubt that in particular at this time of year, many of you are thinking carefully about fraud and scams from a personal point of view as we approach the Christmas period. Today's webinar will help you to stay informed about the latest fraud risks impacting business customers, discussing current threats, and providing guidance to help protect your business from potential financial losses. I am delighted to be joined today by Wynne, Fraud and Scam Prevention Manager at Danske Bank. Chris leads a proactive team focused on safeguarding consumers from card, check, and payment fraud, and has nearly 20 years of experience at Danske Bank behind him. You may have had the opportunity to hear from him at our recent regional breakfast in Uri, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome him back to speak to our members again. To make our session as interactive as possible, I would encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom as Chris covers his content. There's a dedicated Q&A section of today's session, and I know that the topic is one that many of you are thinking about, so do expect to see lots of questions coming through. And finally, I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be made available to members later. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and it's over to you, Chris.
Good afternoon, Jason. Thank you so much for the introduction. Give us 1 second just while I get my screen sharing going live here. Okay. As Jason has kindly introduced me already, I'll not go into too much background, but as he mentioned, I look after a team of colleagues here in Danske Bank in Northern Ireland to help prevent all of our customers from falling victim to fraud. My job is probably quite diverse. You have good days, you have bad days, but unfortunately, whenever customers are victims of fraud, it's usually never a good story, and there's always something that goes on in the background. And the biggest issue that we face as a bank, and this would be echoed across the UK as well, is the level of interest in fraud is probably very, very small until such time as you're victim to it, and then you get very interested in it. And one of the bits of feedback we always get from customers is, well, I never thought it would happen to me. I thought I would be able to catch myself on, or I thought I'd recognize something. And when fraud happens, you're not expecting and you're not waiting for it. It is usually something that comes slightly left field or catches you off guard. And that is probably the biggest issue. And the lack of awareness of some of the more common scams that exists in the UK at the moment is really what drives a lot of the fraud that actually takes place. So awareness is a really strong preventative measure. So thank you all so much for coming along and listening to me ramble on for the next 55 minutes or so, because the awareness that hopefully you'll take away from this today will help prevent fraud going into the future. And if I have one really selfish ask, it is share anything you learn that's new with your friends, with your family, with a bit like myself, anyone who will actually listen to you, because it could help them avoid being victim of a fraud or a scam as well in the future. Now, Jason has stolen my thunder ever so slightly already, but an interesting statistic which the National Crime Agency have published, not just this year, but going back a number of years now, is that fraud is the crime that you're most likely to be victim to in the UK. So if you think of all the other crime that exists out there, fraud is the one that you're most likely to have to report to the police at some point. The concerning piece about that is twofold. The first issue is fraud is also massively underreported. We know many, many customers who are victim of fraud will come and report that to us, but will not report it to law enforcement or report it to Action Fraud. And that's especially prevalent in the business community as well. Number of reasons for that, but the biggest reason usually is embarrassment. Individuals and businesses don't want to make a big song and dance about the fact that they themselves have been taken advantage of, being the victim of fraud, because that could indicate maybe there's a weakness within a firm or there's a weakness within a process, and that could be exploited. And there's always, from a business perspective, a concern that the the wider population, if they became aware of that, that it might make them a little bit less likely to do business with them. So it's something a lot of people don't consider. And most fraud happens, as I say, when you're not expecting it. It could be a text message, it could be a phone call, it could be an email, but you're not sitting waiting for a criminal to reach out and contact you. But that's quite simply how fraud typically tends to happen. And within the UK, there was a report published a couple of years back by the Royal United Services Institute. And within that report, they made quite a few headline statements. And I've got one of them on the screen here now, but there's two others that spring to mind. One of them was they referred to fraud as being the epidemic of its time. And this was 2 years after COVID when you had a pandemic doing the rounds. So it was pretty strong words to use. They also regarded it as the volume crime of its time because there was so much and remains so much, even though this report is 2 years old. I unfortunately can't say that things have gotten better. But the one really relevant point from that report was how they called out the impact that fraud has on the private sector. And that's not just for the stability of individual firms that maybe fall victim to fraud, but also the UK as a place to actually do business and what the reputation that the UK has as a place to do business. One of the reasons that fraud is prevalent in the UK, and let's not say that it's unique to us. It does exist in other parts of the world as well. Of course, it does, but it's particularly prevalent in the UK because we have a very fast payment system. The payment system in the UK, there's three of them, main ones anyway. There's back, there's chaps, and there's faster payments. And faster payments is the one that the clues in the name is the fastest. It is a payment network which allows money to be transferred from one UK bank to another UK bank, usually in seconds. So money moves very fast between UK organizations and UK banks. That sort of instant payment system doesn't really exist at the moment in the rest of Europe. It's coming next year to most of Europe, and it doesn't exist, for example, in the likes of the United States or Canada. Their payment systems are much slower. And there's one thing that criminals love, and that's speed. So the ability for them to move money from bank A to bank B is the bit that they can really leverage and call upon to drive the volumes and drive the values and get them in control of those funds really, really quickly. So it's one of the reasons that the UK is targeted a lot for fraud, because a lot of it exists from outside of the UK. It doesn't necessarily start in the UK; it takes place in other parts of the world, but the victims and the targets are within the United Kingdom. Another reason is English. We all speak English, yeah, and they find that very easy to converse with. But with modern tools coming along, and the likes of Gen AI and those sorts of tools making the ability to speak other languages much more naturally through certain technologies, that might change as time goes forward as well. Whenever I talk about fraud, I'm going to, in this webinar, cover two different types of fraud and break them down into two categories. And those two categories are authorized fraud and unauthorized fraud. So unauthorized fraud is the type of fraud that happens without your knowledge. You effectively open your banking app or look at your bank statement and you see transactions on there that you know nothing about. There's maybe a payment that's went out to Just Eat or a card transaction to Uber, and you've no idea where they came from, how they got there. You just know you didn't do them. And those are the types of transactions that most people worry about. Whenever we ask our customers, talking about fraud, what are you worried about? And they always talk about unauthorized fraud, things happening without their knowledge and without their input. They're really concerned how these happen and how they can stop those sort of things from happening. The other type of fraud then is authorized fraud. And there's a term in particular called authorized push payments that you'll hear me reference during the course of this webinar as well. But authorized fraud is where the victim, so the consumer or the business, you or I basically, are the enabler of that fraud. We actually undertake the transaction. So we go in, set up a payment, and make a transfer to the sort code and the account number of the criminal. Now, we don't do it knowing that we're sending funds to a criminal, of course, but in the grand scheme of events, when you look back on it and realize, then that's effectively what has happened. And whenever we look then at some stats within the UK, and I'm going to talk a bit around numbers now, which is great when I'm on a call with lots of accountants. But when we look at numbers and we look at unauthorized fraud, so UK Finance is an industry body that most large banks in the UK are members of, and we submit MI to them on a regular basis, which allows them to publish some stats half yearly and yearly. So if you look at the half year of the start of 2024, so half one 2024, the average gross unauthorized fraud loss is about £238 per loss. Now, there's a large volume of losses behind there. The unauthorized ROA is where the biggest volume sits. And there's a big pound sign beside it as well, but the average one is £238. The interesting bit then is when you look at the average gross authorized fraud loss in the same period, and it's £2,195. So it's so much more. The volume's much lower, but the value can be quite significant. And that's the one where we send the payment. So whenever it comes to fraud, and whenever it comes to controls that businesses, that consumers, and indeed banks have in place, criminals almost know that in order for transactions to be successful, they need to go after the weakest link in the chain. And that weakest link, unfortunately, is us. We are the weak link in many fraud cases. We are the enabler. We allow information to be given away, or we allow transactions to be made on the basis that we think it's for something else, of course, but it's actually relating to fraud. I'm looking then specifically to Northern Ireland and looking at some of the fraud and cybercrime stats. These are pulled from action fraud reports, which take place and they're available free of charge and publicly available online. But over the last 12 months, we can see that there has been about £19.7 million worth of fraud and cybercrime losses reported in Northern Ireland. And as I mentioned, that's what has been reported. And we know that fraud is massively underreported. And from anecdotally engaging with local law enforcement and seeing the stats they get on a monthly basis compared to what we, as one organisation in Northern Ireland, get reported to us, we know there's a big difference. And I would surmise that that's probably half of what is actually taking place during the course of the last 12 months. And when you put other figures behind that, that's approximately 5,000 victims. And of that £19.7 million, 89% of it relates specifically to fraud. The other remaining 11% is cybercrime related. So 89% of that amount relates to fraud losses, and that's losses through both unauthorized and authorized fraud to victims right here in Northern Ireland. And whilst I don't have a figure specifically for Northern Ireland, I do know that 1 in 5 businesses across the UK have fallen victim to fraud in the last 12 months. And that's a really significant number. And those are businesses of every shape and size. It's from your one-man band right up to your multinational corporate PLCs and everything in between. And of course, the value of the losses will vary greatly between those smaller firms and those bigger firms. We have seen customers who have fallen victim to fraud and have lost 6 figures and 7 figures in some cases, and those funds are often not recoverable, and that's due to how fast the payments can be moved from bank A to bank B, and then maybe dispersed in other ways, like through card transactions or for transfers on the money transfer platforms or in the crypto wallets, for example. So it's very easy for funds to be moved around very, very quickly. So fraud itself has to start somewhere. Where does it all start? Well, it's probably no surprise that most of it starts online. And these figures are also from our friends in UK Finance as well. And about 76% of fraud has started from an online platform. And those online platforms will vary greatly, but it could be social media, it could be just through Google, it could be through chat functions and those sorts of platforms. And within that as well, there still is the old sort of tried and test method. So email's still in there, albeit it's quite small. It's only about 1%. Telecoms accounts for a big portion of that. That's 16% in total. And telecoms can be both phone calls and also the likes of text messages, WhatsApp messages, and so on. And then there's another category in there for other, and that's where there's a smattering of different ways that fraudsters can insert themselves into people's lives. And that includes by traditional letter in the post. Fraud still arrives through Royal Mail, through your letterbox these days as well. And just last week, we got a rake of fraudulent standing orders received into the bank from scammers trying to set up standing orders in some of our customers' accounts. So they still use the old tried and tested methods from time to time as well. I'm looking at that online figure, and we done a bit of research into the scams that were reported to us in Danske Bank last year. And one of the alarming things that we saw was of the scams that we had reported, 62% of those started on social media platforms. So started on the likes of Facebook, X or Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and the such like. So we as a bank are the final part of the journey typically for a scammer, or one of the final parts of the journey. It never starts with a bank. It might start with a scammer impersonating a bank, of course, but it typically emanates from social media platforms. And that's very frustrating because obviously we have no control over what they do to moderate the content on their platforms. But when we talk about scams starting online as well, there's one thing in common with all of the brands that you see on the slide in front of you at the moment, and it's that you'll probably recognize pretty much every single one of them. And I recognize every single one of them as well, because if I look back over the last 12 to 18 months, I can give you examples of where every one of those brands have been used to manipulate customers into giving away information, which ordinarily you would never give away. And scammers are so good at what they do, but in order to try and insert themselves into your lives and into your businesses, they're not going to pretend to be the local chip shop down the road. They're going to pretend to be a well-known, recognized brand because you'll have heard of them before, and you might think there's a good reason for them asking you whatever it is they happen to be asking you. And there's a lot of different techniques that they can use to get that information from you as their target. Some of them will be very familiar to yourselves, some of them maybe not so much. But the first one I'll mention very briefly is phishing. Now, phishing emails, as they usually are, have been around for a very long time, and most companies will have processes in place to filter out phishing emails and to also educate their colleagues on how to detect them, and also ways of reporting them, and maybe even do some sort of phishing email testing within firms as well. I actually had a colleague this morning who turns out that seems that we're doing some at the moment, and they got one that was supposedly from Amazon when it wasn't. And phishing emails aren't like they used to be. Many years ago, a phishing email used to purport to come from some prince from the other side of the world who had millions of whatever currency they have in that country to give away, and all you needed to do was provide them with some information, and a helicopter that straight to you. Nowadays, they're much simpler, but incredibly much more effective as well. So nowadays, they will, for example, purport to come from Netflix, and they'll just say that your Netflix subscription couldn't be renewed, and click here to update your details. And we're so worried about the kids' iPads not being able to watch whatever the kids' cartoons are these days that we'll quickly click on that link and put in the details and then forget that we ever did it. But they're so effective at gathering information. Smishing then is a term which some may be familiar with, and that's through text messages. So it's basically like a phishing email, but instead it's delivered via text. Smishing messages really kicked off back in 2020 whenever we went into lockdown and everyone and their uncle was ordering stuff online and getting things delivered. Scammers quickly realized, hang on a sec here, we can send people text messages pretending to be delivery companies, telling them that there's an item due to be delivered, but there's an issue. So click here to update your details or click here to pay a missed delivery fee or an unpaid delivery fine or whatever it happens to be. Since then, they are very much a daily occurrence landing in people's text message boxes. The interesting thing about smishing and comparing it to phishing is the open rates. And from speaking to some people who work in the world of marketing, the average open rate for a phishing, or not for a phishing email, but for an email, a marketing email, is around 30%. Whenever then they use text messages, whilst they can't track them in quite the same way, they know that the open rate is much higher and it's 80% plus. And we're probably all victim to our phone buzzing. And the first thing you do when your phone buzzes is you glance across at the screen to see what it says. And when a text message is a nice short form of communication, we pay a bit more attention than a longer email. So that's why they've really grasped onto using smishing as a way to try and get information from us. Phishing then is just phishing, but by voice, so over the telephone. So yeah, scammers will just pick up the phone and give you a call. And I have a wee example of how we might see that change going into the future as well. And phishing calls, specifically bank impersonation calls, have been problematic for a long time. And just this year, we've seen a real uptick in some of those cases taking place as well. And it is just as brazen as a scammer phoning you, pretending to be, for example, your bank, and asking you to give away information which your bank would generally never ask you for. But in the heat of the moment, when you get that call, that's not where our mind immediately goes. They will create a scenario to worry you into giving details away. And then the last one on that list is a relatively new one. It has been around for a wee while, but it's getting a little bit more notoriety with some events taking place not too far from where many of us are sitting now. And it's called quishing. So it's basically QR code phishing. So what we saw recently, both across the water and just across the border as well, was pay and display parking meters where criminals were going along, and on your pay and display parking meter, instead of putting your cash in, you could scan a QR code to pay for your pay and display parking. Great if you don't have cash like me. However, criminals thought, here's a way that we can maybe intervene here. So they went and stuck a little sticker over the QR code that was on the machine, and that QR code was for the scam website that they'd set up. And whenever customers went and scanned the QR code, it took them to the scam website, which looked a lot like the parking website. The customers put in all of their details and they put in their card details to pay for the parking and went off on their merry way. And two things then happened. Well, first things first, the scammer had got all their details and they were all of a sudden going to be the victim of fraud in some way. How that transpired varied greatly. And the other thing was they got a parking ticket because they hadn't actually paid for the parking whenever they had scanned that QR code. So quishing is something we're seeing a bit more of. And the issue with quishing as well is when you look at a QR code, you have no idea where that's taking you to because you can't identify, the website address from what you see on the screen. So it's interesting to see how that develops as we go ahead. So thinking about smishing again, I want to give you an example of smishing and show you one that's been doing the rounds quite a lot of late, but also what it turns into and what it can invariably then uh, turn into a scam at the end of it. So many of you may have seen this or indeed something very similar to this. This is a cost of living smishing message. I received this, I think, about 7 or 8 weeks ago now at this point. And there are a few variations of it, but basically it's got a little incentive within it. It's telling me that I'm entitled to claim a cost of living subsidy, and I'm entitled to get a bit of money from the government to reduce the financial pressure in my life, as the message says. So why would you not click on the link on that? Why would you not think, my goodness, I'm getting some free money? Who would look that and say no? And the messages are always same. Smishing messages will always follow the same format. It'll either have an incentive to click on it, as in you're going to get something, or it'll scare you into clicking on the link within it, which is basically saying you're going to be fined, you're going to send the police round, you're going to be arrested, or something along those lines. So you're either going to be incentivized or scared to click on the link in some way, shape, or form. So that message has a link in it. Again, it's what's called a short form URL. So you don't actually, again, know where you're going to because they've shortened the URL, so it doesn't take up too much space in the message. So you don't know that it's not a link to a government website until you actually click on it. So what happens when you do click on it? Well, quite simply, you click on the link, your web browser will open up and it will take you to a web page just like you see on the screen. And if anyone has visited and frequented some of the government web pages, you'll see that that looks a lot like one of them, and a lot like the format of pretty much the majority of them. The first screen after the text message tells me that I'm entitled to £900. So you're all of a sudden finding out that you're going to be quids in if you complete the process and go forward. So whenever you click on next, it takes you to a page that asks you for some personal information. That's going to include your name, first and last, your email address, your phone number, and also your postal address. And when you click on next, it takes you to a page basically to say that, look, in order to pay your £900 into your account, we need some payment details. So give us your card information. We'll take a payment of £1 just to make sure that's actually yours. Don't worry, you'll get it back. You click on next then, and it asks you to enter a verification code. Now, this scam can go in a number of different ways. This example, what actually happens is the scammer is sitting at the other end of that screen live, waiting for people to key information in. And whenever they key the information in, then they actually try and set up Google Pay or Apple Pay on a device they have sitting with them. And the verification code they're asking for in that screen is actually the verification code that your bank would send you when you try and add, if you genuinely did it, when you try and genuinely add Google Pay or Apple Pay onto your own device. And what they would then do is once they've got your card registered on their device, they'll take themselves off and maybe walk into Argos, buy something. Believe it or not, they'll go on to Love Holidays and book a holiday, book flights. They'll book accommodation. They will use all sorts of very normal websites to make normal purchases, but things that they can exchange for goods or cash or sell on to other people at some point in the future. So it's really, really easy for them to gather information. And what a lot of people don't realize as well is on that first personal information screen, when you click next, a lot of people get to the next screen and maybe think, oh, actually, I'm not so sure this is real. I'm not going to go any further. Or they maybe get to the next screen and they don't enter the verification code. But every time you click next, that information is saved down and is available for a scammer then. And they're very good at warehousing this information, holding it and going back and using it again and again and again. So once the information is given away, even if it's used once, they will still come back and try and use it again at some point in the future as well. So they'll never let anything go to waste. And what we would tend to see is some customers do fill in the information, then they realize they've been scammed. They'll come to us, they'll cancel their card, which is great. So that stops the card from being any use. And it's then where we have to say, well, hang on a wee sec, just what has happened here is you need to be very mindful. You still might get a call from someone or an email from someone because they know a lot about you now. They know not just your mobile number, but they also your full first name and last name and your email address and your postal address. And they also know that you bank with Danske Bank. So just be very careful about any calls that you might get coming forward. And just to show you that scammers are very adept at their target audience, just yesterday at 20 past 12, I got a text message to my phone, and it was another smishing message, and it was to do with the winter fuel heating payment in this case. Now, the one reason I wanted to point this out today, and I put it into the slide, was the winter fuel heating payment is, I think, payable to people that are 66 and older, according to Google anyway. So scammers know that the older population maybe might not be as au fait with clicking on a link in an email, or their device indeed might not allow them to. It might be using a very old traditional phone which doesn't have a browser in it. So they want to make sure they can really have a really, really good hit rate. So in this message, they actually included a phone number. Yeah, so the scammer realizes that their target audience may not click on the link, but hang on, we'll give them a phone number to call instead. Now, as of this morning, that phone number is dead, it doesn't work, but it could pop up at another time in the very near future for someone to give them a call. And instead of clicking on a link and giving away your details, you'll phone that number and you'll end up speaking with a scammer, and they'll just take your details over the phone instead. So they're very wily in their ways in terms of how they get their messages out there and what they think of in terms of their targeted campaign. And as well as getting information from us in that way, and that could be used in lots of different ways. There's loads of other open source sites that they can get information from without contacting us at all. And social media is one of the most obvious places that you would think of. LinkedIn is a great source of information for scammers. We know so many times that, for example, when someone updates where they work on LinkedIn, they're inundated with scam communications pretending to be CEOs or people in the firm trying to make introductions or make contacts or fish further information from them. But another really, really popular source of information for scammers is Companies House. So the government website themselves. Companies House is completely open source. It is available for anyone in the entire world to go onto. And as many of you will be familiar with, it contains lots of information about incorporated firms within the UK. If you're an incorporated firm, you'll be registered with Companies House, and therefore information about your directors, your shareholders will be on there. For example, directors' information will include their name, maybe their home address. A lot of people have stopped putting home addresses on there, which is great, and it'll just have a business address instead. But it'll also have, for example, their month and year of birth. Up until a few years ago, it had the full date of birth on there, but thankfully there was a bit of common sense applied. But it'll also have other information as well, so you can get a copy of financial accounts from Companies House. A copy of financial accounts will maybe say who your accountant is. It might tell you directly who you bank with. And if it doesn't, then there might be, for example, a mortgage charge or debenture registered on Companies House, and it will tell you on that who registered the debenture. So, for example, if a customer of ours has a mortgage, the mortgage will be registered there, and it'll say it's from Northern Bank Limited, or whatever bank it happens to be. So again, criminals can very easily use the likes of Companies House to get a lot of information to then target and be very specific in their targeting of the businesses or consumers indeed as well. This year, I mentioned phishing calls, and we had seen a spate of cases where our customers were getting phone calls from scammers pretending to be from the Danske Bank fraud department. And whenever we then took a look back at those cases that we were seeing, pretty much most, if not all of them, were incorporated companies. And when we delved a little bit deeper, every single one of them had a charge registered, a floating charge or a mortgage debenture registered by Northern Bank Limited, which was available on Companies House. So we could quite easily ascertain that there's a strong possibility that the criminals were using Companies House as a way to generate a list of people to target, and knowing to phone them to say that they are the Danske Bank fraud team. Because if you phone a Danske Bank customer and say that I'm from the Ulster Bank fraud team, they may not engage. But if they say the right name, then they might. And that's what we were seeing happening. And that is probably a really important and really sort of good way to segue into the next conversation. And it is about the sort of unauthorized fraud and bank impersonation fraud in particular, because it's not uncommon. It has been around for a long time. We have cases of bank impersonation going back 6, 7, 8 years. I remember the first one that was reported to us that I was involved in, which was back in 2018. So it's been around for a while now. But the the concept is very simple. The scammer will phone you and they will pretend to be the bank. And typically they'll pretend to be the bank that you bank with. And a lot of people do wonder, how do they know that when they phone me? And it's a good question. And whilst we could never say for certain, we certainly know there's a few ways that they would. Company's House, which I've covered already, is definitely one of them. But if you think back to that scam text message on the HMRC website, which asked for card details, one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that the first 6 digits of your debit or credit card is known as the bank identification number. And those first 6 digits, if you go onto another website online, which is completely legitimate, free, and open source for anyone to use, and key those 6 digits in, you can find out who issued the card, as in the name of the bank, what country it was issued in, is it a debit card or is it a credit card, and is it a MasterCard or is it a Visa? So it's really simple for criminals to take some of the information, which again we have given away, and turn it into useful information so they know who to target. And unauthorized fraud is driven a lot by that social engineering element. Banks have controls in place. We have to, we're duty bound, and we're regulated to do so to stop unauthorized transactions, to stop criminals from just being able to undertake transactions on our customers' accounts. So if we think back to that text message where a consumer or a business is given away their name, their full address, their email address, their phone number, and all of their card details, that usually still isn't enough for a scammer to undertake a transaction. Because many of you who maybe shop online know that when you go and make a purchase, that you'll maybe get sent a text message with a code in it, or you'll have to go to an authenticator app to actually make the transaction take place. And scammers know that as well. So that's where they have to get a bit more creative, and they have to pick up the phone, or they have to create a way for you to give away that code in some way, shape, or form. And that's why it's really important whenever you're undertaking those transactions, or indeed if you're not undertaking a transaction, but all of a sudden you start getting messages like you are, that would point out that someone's trying to use your card details or some of your banking details in an authorized way. And always pay attention to the warnings that are in there. Warnings are great, but they can become a bit like wallpaper. But we banks and other firms as well put them there for a reason. You'll see that when you get sent a 6 digit code on a text message, it usually says, never share this code, or don't tell anyone this code, or a warning of some description. And that's the firm trying to really say, please don't give this away, because this is the key to your front door in terms of people getting into your, for example, bank account. So it's really important they pay attention to the warnings and the messages that are shown whenever these types of transactions take place. And unauthorized fraud, as I say, it is problematic, but I want to go back and chat a little bit about authorized fraud, and talk a little around some of the risks that we see, specifically business customers falling victim to within the UK at the moment. Now, authorized push payments are not a new phenomenon. They have been a wee bit in the news of late, because of some regulatory changes, but they have been around for a long time, albeit scammers know that it can be more difficult to undertake unauthorized transactions because of the controls that have been put in place over the years and how they've been made robust. And they've sort of thought, well, what's the best way around this? And the best way around it is, let's just manipulate and socially engineer the victim to send me the money instead of me trying to steal the money from them and actually go in and get it without them knowing. And they've discovered that there's many, many ways to do that quite easily. And authorized push payments are what drive a lot of that. So if we look at the stats again, going back to half one this year, and again these are stats from UK Finance, there was £150 million lost to authorised payment fraud just in the first half of this year. That's made up of almost 90,000 victims, and it covers about 165 or just under that thousand payments, individual payments, and that's just in the first half of this year. So the volume and the value of these are significant. Now, it almost pales into insignificance whenever you overlay the total volume, for example, of payments that are made in the UK, because that runs into the billions. But the impact on the individuals that fall victim to fraud and the firms that fall victim to fraud can be significant. It will, as I said at the very beginning, a firm can go out of business as a result of being the victim of fraud. And that's both internal fraud as well as external fraud, but external fraud in particular. It's mind-boggling the effect that sometimes that this can have on businesses right here in Northern Ireland. Whilst there are 8 categories of authorised push payment fraud in total, I don't have time to talk about all 8 of them. I would love to, and as anyone will attest to, I usually don't shut up quickly enough. So I'm going to focus on 2 in particular. And these are the 2 where there's the biggest sort of pound signs beside it in terms of where's the biggest chances of loss and the biggest value of loss. So therefore, the ones that could have the biggest impact on your business are. And there's 2 categories, and one of them is called invoice or mandate fraud. It's the same thing, just a slightly different term. And the other one is CEO fraud. And I'll talk about both of them in a wee bit of detail in the next couple of slides. As I say, these carry the biggest loss values They don't carry the biggest volume by any stretch of the imagination. Purchase scams have the biggest volume when it comes to the type of scams reported in the UK, but the value is much, much, much lower. So these two are the big hitters from a value perspective. So invoice or mandate fraud, what is it? And why is it a problem? Well, first of all, it's effectively whenever the victim, so you or I, attempts to pay an invoice to a legitimate payee, but the criminal intervenes in the process in some way, shape, or form to redirect where you're sending the payment. So instead of sending it to an account that is the intended beneficiary, they send it to an account that the criminal instead controls. And the important thing to call out here is that from the point that you make a payment to the point that it's received, that can't be intercepted. Once you send it to a sort code and an account number, it will arrive in that sort code and that account number. So it's before you've even made the payment that they insert themselves into your life. So the first half of 2024, there was 25.7 million pounds lost to businesses alone. For invoice or mandate fraud. And that's up 4% on the same period last year. So unfortunately, that figure went the wrong way. The figure is always quite large. And when we were looking at some of the trends, it is trending to be over, again, at the end of this year, it'll be higher than it was for full year 2023 as well. And the pretense is very, very simple. And the way to prevent it is also very, very simple, but it's the one that's often overlooked the most. And the prevention stops it in its tracks every single time. So depending on the type of screen you're looking at, you may or may not be able to read some of the information on screen, but effectively what you're looking at is two invoices. They look very similar from a distance. However, there are some small changes made to the invoice. So these are actual invoices which one of our customers provided us. Our customer had been dealing with a trader, and they were preparing to purchase a Hitachi piece of high lift device from them. And they had been emailing them backwards and forwards and doing all the bits and bobs and their due diligence, and they'd looked at the pictures and they'd checked the serial number and everything else, and everything was good. So they decided to buy it. So they said, look, send us an invoice. Once we get that, we'll arrange for the payment. So our customer was sitting waiting for the invoice to arrive, and lo and behold, it popped into their mailbox. Email came in, the PDF was attached. They opened the PDF, and the invoice on the left is the one that the customer received first. So the invoice detailed the equipment that we're buying, the serial number matched what they've been talking about, the purchase price was correct, the VAT amount was right. They were happy that the details on there were correct. And helpfully, as many invoices have, it has the remittance information on there as well. So it had your account name, your sort code, your account number, and also the name of the bank that you were sending the funds to. So our customer looked at it, thought, okay, I will make that payment now. So they went ahead, made the transfer. The funds went off to an account in HSBC, and the customer then arranged for a low loader to go pick up the equipment, which was across the water in GB. That low loader arrived about 3 days later to pick up the piece of equipment. And whenever it arrived, the person selling it was like, I can't let this go. We have not been paid for it yet. So the guy was like, oh, right, okay. Let me get in contact with the guy who sent me here. So they did. And the buyer, our customer, then contacted the seller and said, look, we sent you that money a few days ago. You should have got it by now. Can you check your bank again? And they went on and looked and said, look, we haven't got that. Can you maybe do a trace to your bank? So they came to us. We said, look, we could see from faster payments, you get a message back straight away, and we could see this money has gone to the account in HSBC. So our customer went back and said, that's in your HSBC account. And it was at that point then the beneficiary, the seller said, well, we bank with Bank of Scotland, so why have you sent it to HSBC? And it was at that point then the penny had dropped. So our customer then said, look, can you send me that invoice on again? And the document on the right then is the actual invoice that the customer should have received in the first instance. And there's been a couple of subtle amendments made to the document. So at the very top, there's been two words put before the genuine beneficiary name, and those two words are RDTK, which is a first and last name. And then down at the bottom, the sort code and account number have been changed. The name of the bank has been changed from Bank of Scotland to HSBC. And again, the account name has been changed to include those same two words, early decay, at the start of the account name. Now, there's a bit of relevance to putting those two words at the start of it. It's not some sort of cryptic-y weird one. It's very simply a name. It's a first name and a last name. And you may be aware of a system in the UK called confirmation of payee. So whenever you make a payment to a bank account in the UK, so long as the sort code and account number is valid, the money will go into the account. Simple as that. Doesn't matter what the name on the account is versus what you've put on, the money will go into the account. Confirmation of pay was introduced a few years ago, and it basically gives the sender a bit of information about the beneficiary account. So you may see, and whoever you bank with, a warning that comes up and says that this doesn't match. So if you put in the name Mickey Mouse and you're sending it to Chris Wynne, it'll tell you that's not the right name. If it's a close match, then it might say it's a close match. Here's what the name on the account actually is. Or if it's a full match, it'll just say, yes, this is a full match, that the name you've input matches the name on the beneficiary account. And it's there to help consumers take a bit more of I suppose, a guided approach to making payments, because we're not allowed to stop a customer from making payment if that name doesn't match. That's what the scheme rules are. But we have to tell them the risk of doing it. So the reason the scammer has put early decay at the start of that is if the customer just put in the business name as was the genuine business name, that's not the name on the recipient's account. So it'll come back and say this doesn't match. Be really, really careful. But by them putting that name at the start of it, there's a chance then that the recipient bank might go, this is a close match because those two names aren't correct, but the rest of it is. So they might say, this is a close match. Did you mean? And then it'll give you the name on the actual account. Now, again, that should have been enough of a warning, but unfortunately, it wasn't heeded and the payment went ahead and sent. And the reason I mention that in particular is confirmation of pay is a really powerful tool, but again, it goes back to reading the message on the screen and paying attention to the warnings that are being presented. We see too many cases whereby, for example, payments are sent to accounts where the name doesn't match at all, but consumers and businesses don't pay attention to that warning and just think it'll be fine. Unfortunately, it's not fine until it is, or it isn't fine until it isn't. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Now, the one really strong mitigant and control to prevent this type of fraud is so simple, and it's just verifying that sort code and account number before any payment is sent. And what I mean by verifying that is when a customer receives an invoice, the one thing we would always ask them to do is if you've got an invoice from someone that you've never paid before, is stop. Don't make any payments until you have contacted the beneficiary of those funds, the person you intend to pay, and said to them, I've got your invoice, your sort code is this, and your account number is this. Is that correct? And you do that typically in a phone call. In person, if you could, that would be really ideal, but of course, that's not necessarily always practicable. But you give them a call on a number you know to be correct, so not the one that's on the invoice, for example, because the scammer might have changed that. And you definitely don't reply to the email that it came in on, because again, you might just be replying to the scammer. But if you give them a call and confirm those details, that stops invoice redirection fraud in its tracks. But that doesn't happen enough. And the one really frustrating part of this is a lot of businesses do have controls in place where that is the process, but often sometimes it's not followed. And we often have a term called Friday fraud, where at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, when you're in a rush out the door, that's when we tend to see a little uptick in these types of cases because there's a control, but it's Friday afternoon, I want to get out the door, and it's not followed and the money gets sent on its way. So it's really important that the simple step of just verifying that sort code and account number is taken, and it doesn't need to be a cottage industry of um, process. It's only needed when there's a verification of a payment to a new payee, which has never been paid before, or indeed if payments details that you've been using previously are changing. So if you've been paying someone religiously to their bank account that's in Barclays and it's always in Barclays, it's always in Barclays and always in Barclays, and all of a sudden it's changed to Revolut, that's the point to go, oh, hang on a sec, I'm going to contact that beneficiary and just say, did your details actually change and are they now this? And that does happen. Of course, people change banks. So it's just that verification step when new details are supplied or if there's change of details from what was previously being used. And the reason that mandate fraud is mentioned as well is because we see payroll departments being targeted by scammers as well. Payroll redirection is a problem, and payroll departments often get emails from people they think are their colleagues, and they're basically asking them, can you please pay my salary into this bank account instead of the account that we're using? And the same principle applies. You take a moment, you stop, you look at the email that's come in, and you do an element of verification. So you put out a call to that colleague to say, we've got your email. Is your sort code and account number actually changing? And if they turn around and say yes, and that's on a number you know to be genuine and correct for that colleague, then great. Or if it's not, then you realize there's a bit of an issue. And whenever you're looking at those sort of things as well, as sometimes, for example, firms can have controls in place on their emails where it'll highlight if an email has came from an external source, and that sometimes can be a really strong mitigant against these types of fraud. Because if you've got an email in a HR department from someone that's supposedly from their internal email, but it's saying it's from an external email address, again, that's just another little warning that could point out that it's came from a different source. Invoice and mandate scams, as I say, it's probably one of the most preventable scams by that simple control, but it's that simple control that is often overlooked and can cause such a big issue. And sometimes there's other warning signs to think about, and other warning signs that can be overlooked, but they're missed because, again, people don't think about the potential and the risk of actually sending a payment and how quick they are and the fact they're irrecoverable once funds are actually sent. Now, moving on, the other one I mentioned was CEO fraud, and I don't like the term. It's an industry term, but basically, it's where a scammer, manages to impersonate a CEO or indeed a senior official in an organization, and then against the victim who's usually someone more junior. So this could be, a CEO of a firm down to someone in accounts. This could be partner in a solicitor's firm, again to the bookkeeper. It could be a small club or society, the chair to the treasurer. It doesn't need to be big grandeur firms. It can be any firm just where you've got that different levels of seniority. And basically convince them to make an urgent payment or as is becoming probably more common, go off and buy some gift cards or vouchers. And you sort of think, how does that work? And I'll come to that in a wee second. But effectively, it is just that sort of hierarchical issue that can exist. And a big part of the success of some CEO fraud also comes from the culture within firms. If a firm has a culture where challenge would not be welcomed, where asking a question of someone more senior about, for example, the way to make a payment would be frowned upon, then that's where firms have issues when it comes to CEO fraud. So culture in a firm can drive a lot of the fraud. And if you have someone who would never ever question an email that comes in from the CEO because to do that they think it would be detrimental to their career, then there's a good chance that person may unfortunately allow the firm to become victim of fraud at some point in the future. And when we look at the first half of the year, again looking at the stats, losses aren't as big, but still almost 8 million quid, and unfortunately up 13% on the same period last year as well. And a couple of examples just to show you on screen. Again, they're a bit small, but the email in the middle is just a sort of a mock-up of what a CEO fraud email might look like. And it's effectively a CEO of a firm reaching out to someone there to say, look, there's an urgent payment that needs to be made. There's a project that I'm working on at the moment. I've been told the invoice hasn't been paid. Can you quickly make this payment? Here's the amount. Here's the sort code. Here's the account number. This really needs to go. I'm relying on you to get this done. And sort of really putting a little bit of, I suppose, very subtle pressure on the victim to react to this, thinking they're dealing with the CEO. And then also, I've got a WhatsApp message on the screen here as well. This was actually received by one of our colleagues in the organization. This purported to come from our CEO in Danske Bank. And all our colleague did whenever they joined the organization was update where they worked on LinkedIn. And a couple of weeks later, they got this WhatsApp message through. So it just again demonstrates that scammers and criminals will scour the web and scour open source information sites to try and use the information that's there to target and potentially turn those targets into victims. Now, what would have happened, for example, if a response had been given to one of those messages? Usually it'll turn into one of two things, but I've mentioned already. It'll turn into a request for funds to be sent for the payment of goods, the payment of services, or indeed the gift cards that I mentioned. And we've seen cases whereby a colleague has got an email from a CEO or a message from a CEO, basically to say, we've had a great year this year. Everyone's worked so hard. Christmas is just around the corner. So I'm going to give everyone £100 Amazon vouchers. Can you go off and buy me £2,000 worth of Amazon vouchers? And when you get them, give me the codes, just send them through in an email, scratch them off, send them through to me, and I'm going to send everyone a personalized email. And we have customers that do that. They'll walk into Tesco and buy a significant number of gift cards, or they'll go online and buy it. And this is where the industry then works a little bit more joined up. If you've ever been into the likes of Tesco, for example, they have a little warning on the gift card stand which talks about gift card scams, and it's directly related to this type of activity. So thankfully, there is often a joined up approach to try and help prevent this type of fraud from taking place as well. Now, yeah, getting towards the end of the session, but I wanted to just talk a bit about AI, because everyone's talking about it, so I thought I may as well. So I want to give you a very, 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 very simple example of one of the things AI could do to change the fraud landscape. And you may have heard of a thing called a robocall. Basically, it's a little phone call you get, which has a very robotic voice at the end of it. And those robocalls often purport to be an organization, and it's a way for scammers to try and weed out who's more vulnerable versus who's not more vulnerable. So effectively, the call you'll hear in a wee second is it's going to try and see, will the customer engage? Will the customer press one? If they don't press one, then the scammer's wasted no time because the computer's made the phone call. But if they do press one, they realize, okay, we might have someone on the hook. So here's what an Amazon robocall sounds a bit like.
Hi, this is a call from Amazon to inform you that your Amazon Prime account will be auto-renew for $39.99 from your bank account, so enjoy using Amazon Prime services, or if you want to discontinue or unsubscribe the services, then speak to an Amazon service manager by pressing 1.
So really straightforward, very robotic in its nature in terms of how you listen to it. But as you'll probably pick up, people will realize that that is a scam, and they will not engage. Now, all you need to do nowadays to turn that into something a little bit more convincing is head on over to one of the free to use Gen AI tools. So, for example, ChatGPT or Gemini would be two that spring immediately to mind. And you take the script. So, what I did, and this took me from start to finish about 5 minutes, I took the script of what you just heard there a second ago, and I put it into Gemini. Then I asked Gemini to make this sound more human and more engaging. That is all I said. That's the prompt I gave it, and it went off and generated a new script for me. So I took that script and I put it into a Gen AI tool to generate a new voice to go along with it. And then I asked it also to generate a video avatar for me as well, in case I wanted to use it in some sort of a video way as well. So that took me 5 minutes from start to finish. And I'll just let you see what the output of that is. So give us a wee second and let me do this.
Hey there. This is a friendly reminder from Amazon about your Prime membership. We wanted to let you know that your account is set to renew automatically for £39.99. We hope you're loving all the Prime benefits like free and fast shipping, Prime video streaming, and exclusive deals. If you'd like to make any changes to your membership, like updating your payment information or canceling your subscription, just press 1 to speak with one of our helpful customer service representatives. Thanks for being a Prime member.
So 5 minutes from the first robocall you heard to what you've just seen on the screen now, and that's using free to use tools. I did not pay for any of that, and I'm not as skilled as some people might be when it comes to using these things. So with very little skill and very little time, that's what I could create. So you can imagine how thinking, for example, about CEO fraud, how that could really be turned on its head when it comes to the type of scams that customers will fall victim to, and how voice cloning has been used. There was a case in Singapore where a customer fell victim to an AI-generated image of a video call, and funds were sent. Now, we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but I'm sure it's not far away. And there's no shortage of open source information and videos of a lot of people out there, especially more senior folks within firms as well. So as we get towards the very end, there's one thing I just want to mention in particular. And whenever we talk about fraud and talk about scams, everyone thinks about the money because there's a lot of it and there's a lot of money lost as a result of it. And where that money goes is very worrying. However, when it comes to fraud and scams, simply, for example, reimbursing people and filling up the financial hole that's left behind after a scam, it doesn't really help when it comes to there's a psychological void that's created. And the way that a victim of fraud feels after they've been the victim of fraud, they often feel cheated, embarrassed. They can't believe that they did what they did. And be it a victim personally or be it a victim as part of an organization, it leaves a mark. So prevention is absolutely better than the cure, and actually stopping fraud before it happens is the way to deal with it. So the more awareness activity we can do, the more we can talk to customers and consumers and businesses about what's going on out there, hopefully the more we can prevent, and the more that people we can stop feeling a little bit sheepish about what might have actually happened at some point in the past. And if, unfortunately, you are a victim of fraud, a few things to keep in mind and to consider just as we come to the end. First and foremost, if you've lost any funds, if you've made a transfer, or indeed if you've given away any personal details such as log-on details, sort codes, account numbers, or card details, contact whoever issued them and let them know as soon as possible. If you've transferred funds, the PSP, the bank in question, will be able to start the recovery process for you where possible. And if there's log-on details that have been divulged, they'll obviously take action to lock those down. Report it to the police or report it to Action Fraud. It is really important that everyone is reporting. I'm not going to say that an awful lot will happen whenever you report to these services because honestly won't. However, the more reporting it takes place, the bigger chance that there will be more resources put into the work that goes on. Whilst fraud is the most common crime that you're going to be victim to in the UK, it only equates to about 2% of policing. And a lot of it is driven because there's so little of it reported. So the more reports, the better. And then the examples of the phishing messages and the smishing emails that or text messages that I mentioned, they can also be reported. And there's two central services that exist in the UK where you can report those to. The first one is for your phishing emails. You send it to report@phishing.gov.uk, and the National Cybersecurity Centre will take action. And if you get one of those pesky smishing messages, you can forward that to the number 7726. And your mobile network operator, they'll reply to you to ask you for the text message number that the message came from. And once they do that, then they will take some action against it. And then just in closing, three very short but very poignant words: stop, challenge, and protect. Um, if we did more of this, we would prevent a lot more fraud. So the first thing is take a moment to stop. Think before sending money or giving away information because it could keep you safe. We just love making others happy and doing what we're told and replying to people when they want to be replied to and being very efficient. But sometimes we need to slow down and don't let ourselves be put under pressure. Ask yourself if it could be fake. It is okay to reject. It's okay to say no. Whenever we phone our customers and ask them about payments that they've made, we would love more people to hang up on us. More, very immediately customers will just start spewing information to us before they even know who they're speaking to. And it's that, I suppose, safeguard that we want to put in place to make people just stop and think about what it is that they're doing and, say no. It's only criminals that would ever try and rush or panic you into take some action or to give away information. And as I mentioned, if you have been the victim, it's important you contact your bank immediately in case you've been scammed. That is pretty much it from me. I've done my best to squeeze this into the time that we have. And as Jason mentioned at the very beginning as well, we do have some time for questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Chris. That's really interesting. We do have a couple of questions come through, and we do have a couple of minutes. Somebody that gets a lot of those scam Amazon calls. I'm a little bit concerned about the sophistication that there is with AI tools. So taking a couple of these quickly. So looking at the false invoice one, so how do you think the scam around the false invoice, how did they have all the information? How did they know when to send it? Because obviously they've sent the invoice at the right time that somebody's expecting.
So they've usually started somewhere else, and typically what will have happened is the criminal have got access to a mailbox, an email box. So it's either the sender's email box or the recipient's email box. The example that I showed on the screen there, they'd actually got access to our customer, so the recipient's email box. And whenever they had got access to that, they'd set up mail rules on their mailbox to look for emails with specific subject matter points. So the mail rules will look for emails like invoice, sort code, BIC, SWIFT, IBAN, those sorts of things. That rule then takes that email and hides it off in this separate folder. They've set up another mail rule then, which will then send the scammer an email to let them know there's an email of interest to go and look at. And then they've set up another mail rule to delete the sent email from the sent mailbox so the customer doesn't realize that there's emails being pinged about the place. The scammer then will then go back into the mailbox, take the PDF, alter, and resend it back in to the customer. So that's how they know to be there when it actually happens. So it's typically came from information that's been divulged at some point. The scammers then got into the person's emails. So that's why keeping your email secure, your email password safe, secure, and not giving that away is also very important.
That's really interesting. How are fraudsters able to open accounts without banks catching on?
Because they don't tell us they're fraudsters is probably the first part in that one. It's a great question though. Accounts that are opened, which are then used by fraudsters, are done in lots of different ways and typically using perfectly genuine documents and information. So obviously we have very strict know your customer rules that we have to follow when we open accounts. And we have to identify the customer. We've got to ask for proof of ID, proof of address. If it's an incorporated firm, we'll need all the company and corporation documents, so on as well. So they're either using stolen documents from others, or they're using synthetic documents, so fake IDs and so on, which are available out there and are very, 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 very good. It's definitely a problem. And now one of the things that I think we're starting to see more of is banks are working our damnedest to try and prevent them from opening an account. And what we're seeing more of is genuine businesses and genuine individuals' accounts being used for mule purposes instead. So we have genuine customers of all ages, not just young people, but young people are definitely very susceptible to this, who are enticed to allow their bank account to be used for fraudulent purposes. So you'll get a request to have a bit of money paid into your account, but you can keep a wee bit of it and you send the rest of it on. We've also seen business customers who have went into their account, they've seen there's a payment in for say 10 grand and think, I have no idea what that is. And then they get an email from someone and say, oh, I'm really sorry. We done business with you 5 years ago and we paid you by accident. Can you send that back to us? Here's our sort code and account number. But you don't realize that it's came from a different sort code and account number, and that's from a victim of a scam. And the scammer is then using a perfectly legitimate business to be the mule for those funds to move them on as well. So they're quite ingenious in terms of if they can't get their own accounts, they might get other accounts. And then there are so many virtual PSPs and so on that exist. There's maybe some questions around controls and stuff that are in place for onboarding in outside of your traditional bricks and mortar banks.
Okay, that's quite worrying, isn't it? So we're at the top of the hour, so we'll make this maybe the last question. In what instance are the bank not liable to reimburse victims of fraud?
So at the moment, there's been a big change in the UK. So unauthorized fraud, typically the bank is liable to refund where the customer hasn't acted with gross negligence. That's a very horrible term. I don't like using it, but that's how it is. From the 7th of October, there was a change in relation to authorized push payments. And there's a new bit of legislation that's came in where basically we're consumers, and consumers are personal customers, micro enterprise businesses, so smaller businesses and charities with a turnover of less than £1 million. They are covered by a new reimbursement scheme which covers them for up to £85,000 of losses through funds which are sent through an authorized push payment. Because where a bank isn't liable and where customers aren't protected, for example, under that scheme is where a customer is classed as what's called corporate opt-out, and that scheme only covers faster payments made within the UK and chaps made within the UK. So it doesn't cover the likes of international money transfer or a BACS payment, for example, or indeed cash or card that are authorized payments as well. So there was for a long time a very big distinction between unauthorized fraud and authorized fraud. That's somewhat closed with that new regulation, but of course there still are a few exclusions, the international transfers being one, and those corporate opt-out customers, those larger customers, which aren't covered as well.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Listen, given the time, we'll maybe leave the questions there. So can I just in closing just say thank you, Chris, for such an interesting session. Really interesting. A lot of sort of eye-opening stuff for people to take away definitely today. Thanks to everybody that posted their questions in the chat. And thanks to so many of you for being in attendance and for staying with us through the whole time, which is great to see. The recording will be available shortly for you to watch back again. So coming up in the new year, the CAB committee will have 2 more company visits with details and locations to be released in due course. Just going to keep you in suspense for just a little bit longer on those, as well as an online panel discussion on the topic of skills with a number of excellent speakers, which will be held in late January. So just look out via the usual channels for details of these events when they're released. So with that, just one more time, I'd like to thank our fantastic speaker, Chris. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you to the team at the Ulster Society for all their support, both for today's event and indeed across the entire year, given we're at 10th of December now. And of course, thank you to all of you for being in attendance to support today's event. Hopefully see you at another one soon. And in the meantime, I hope you have a lovely break over the festive period.